The air inside Ekla was different from the bustling energy of the Upper East Side just outside its heavy oak doors. It was rarefied, chilled to a precise temperature that seemed designed to preserve the art on the walls and the fortunes of the people seated at its tables. Sterling silver cutlery rested on starched linen with geometric precision, and light from minimalist fixtures caught the facets of crystal glasses, scattering cold rainbows across the room. Conversations were hushed, a low hum of billion-dollar mergers and exclusive stock tips spoken between bites of meticulously plated food. The clientele were the kings of New York City, masters of finance and technology who commanded empires from their phones, and moving between them, almost invisible, were the staff. They were shadows in crisp uniforms, their faces neutral masks of professional deference, their movements swift and silent, betraying none of the tension that coiled in the space between the kitchen and the dining room. From his silent, darkened office overlooking the main dining floor, Arthur watched it all on a bank of high-definition monitors. He was the architect of this world, the heir to a culinary empire who had perfected the art of manufactured perfection. Dressed in a bespoke suit that cost more than his employees' monthly rent, a luxury watch gleaming subtly at his wrist, he looked every bit the part of a man who had everything. Yet his expression was one of profound detachment, his eyes scanning the screens not with pride, but with the dispassionate analysis of an accountant reviewing a ledger. Each guest was a revenue stream, each staff member a controllable expense. He had spent his life creating these temples of connection for others, yet he himself felt nothing. He was a ghost in his own machine, a master of an empty kingdom, profoundly and utterly alone. His gaze drifted to one of the shadows, a young woman named Elena. He knew her file, 23 from the Bronx. A grueling 2-hour commute each way. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, but it couldn't hide the weariness in her posture, a subtle slump of the shoulders that spoke of long days and longer nights. But her eyes, when she turned toward a camera for a brief moment, held a spark of fierce intelligence that seemed out of place. Tonight, that spark was focused on the most important table in the room. A group of Chinese investors were there to close a 9-figure real estate deal, and the translator hadn't shown up. The restaurant manager was sweating. His polite smile stretched thin as the conversation at the table grew strained and fragmented. Arthur could see the deal, a massive win for a key client, crumbling into a disaster of gestures and misunderstandings. Arthur sighed, ready to mentally write off the client and the manager's future at his restaurant. It was just another liability, another failure in a system built on fragile human components. He reached for a glass of scotch when a movement on the screen caught his eye. It was Elena. She was approaching the table, her steps calm and deliberate. The manager tried to wave her away, but she ignored him. She stood beside the investors, took a small, respectful bow, and began to speak. The words that flowed from her were not English, but flawless, fluent Mandarin. The tension at the table didn't just break, it evaporated. She translated not just the words, but the nuance, the cultural context. Her voice a bridge across a chasm of misunderstanding. From his sterile office, Arthur leaned forward, stunned into silence. He wasn't looking at a waitress anymore. He was looking at a hidden masterpiece. The silence in Arthur's office was heavier than the oak door Elena had just closed behind her. She stood before his vast mahogany desk, a small, weary figure swallowed by a room that smelled of old leather and new money. Arthur watched her, his professional mask firmly in place, but behind his eyes, a genuine curiosity was stirring for the first time in years. He had spent his life orchestrating perfection from a distance, treating his staff as cogs in a flawless machine. Now, one of those cogs had spoken in a voice he never expected, and it had shattered the sterile quiet of his world. He gestured to a chair, an invitation he had never extended to an employee below the level of head chef, and the simple act felt like a tectonic shift in the restaurant's rigid hierarchy. Elena sat on the edge of the leather chair, her back ramrod straight, convinced she was about to be fired for her audacity. The room was a universe away from her tiny Bronx apartment. Here, the city was just a silent, glittering panorama behind soundproof glass. For her, it was a noisy, grinding reality she fought through every day. She thought of her mother, of the stack of medical bills on her nightstand, and braced herself for the inevitable blow. Her hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white, the only outward sign of the terror gripping her. She had gambled everything on that one moment of initiative, and she was certain she had lost, proving once again that people like her were meant to remain invisible. Breaking the silence, Arthur didn't mention her breach of protocol. Instead, his voice was unexpectedly soft when he asked, "Where did you learn to speak Mandarin so fluently?" The question caught her off guard. She had expected a reprimand, not a conversation. Hesitantly, she explained that her late father had been a history professor, a man with a deep love for Chinese poetry and philosophy who had taught her the language as a child. She spoke of evenings spent tracing characters and listening to his stories of ancient dynasties, a warmth creeping into her voice as she recalled a past that felt richer than her present. In that moment, she wasn't just a waitress. She was the daughter of a scholar, a keeper of a legacy that had nothing to do with serving champagne. Arthur listened, completely captivated. Her story was a small, beautiful detail in a world he had painted in broad, cynical strokes. He saw the flicker of her father's passion in her intelligent eyes and felt a sudden, sharp pang of something that resembled admiration. The carefully constructed wall between owner and employee began to crumble. He found himself asking more questions, not as a boss, but as a man genuinely wanting to understand. He asked about her 2-hour commute, about the weariness he saw in her posture, and why someone with her talents was clearing plates for a living. The inquiries were a departure from his detached management style, a deviation from the spreadsheet logic that had governed his entire adult life. Emboldened by his quiet sincerity, Elena allowed a piece of her carefully guarded reality to show. She spoke of her mother's degenerative illness, not with a plea for sympathy, but with the weary pragmatism of a long-term caregiver. She described the relentless cycle of her days, waking before dawn to administer medication, the long train ride into Manhattan, the physically demanding shifts on her feet, and the journey home to a second shift of care and worry. The crushing weight of the American healthcare system was a constant presence in her life, a silent predator that devoured every dollar she earned and threatened to take the only family she had left. Her voice never broke, but her words painted a portrait of quiet, desperate courage. As he listened, a profound and unfamiliar sense of shame washed over Arthur. His own gilded cage of loneliness and ennui felt like a pathetic indulgence compared to her daily, uncomplaining battle for survival. He had built an empire dedicated to providing fleeting moments of pleasure for the rich, all while being completely oblivious to the real human dramas playing out under his own roof. Her strength wasn't just in her knowledge of languages. It was in her resilience, her dignity in the face of overwhelming odds. He felt a sudden, powerful need to act, to do something right in a world he'd built on indifference. It's a feeling that can change everything. And if these stories of transformation resonate with you, please consider subscribing. It allows us to continue sharing them. "This is a waste of your talent," Arthur said, the words coming out with more force than he intended. He stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the city that had given him everything and her so little. He didn't just see a problem to be solved. He saw an opportunity to correct a cosmic injustice. On the spot, he created a new position, a role tailored specifically for her. He offered her the title of Director of International Relations for his entire restaurant group, a job that would utilize her linguistic skills and cultural acuity to manage their growing global clientele. The salary he named was more than she had ever dreamed of making in a year, a number that could rewrite her entire future. Elena stared at him, unable to process his words. Disbelief warred with a fragile, rising tide of hope. The offer was a lifeline thrown into the turbulent waters of her life, so unexpected and so immense that it felt like a dream. When she finally found her voice, it was a choked whisper of gratitude. Tears she had held back for years began to stream down her face, not tears of sadness or self-pity, but of pure, unadulterated relief. In that cold, luxurious office, a genuine human connection was forged, a bond built not on status or wealth, but on a shared moment of vulnerability and a sudden, startling recognition of another's worth. Arthur had offered her a job, but what he had truly given her was a chance to breathe. However, Eleanor's ascent was not celebrated by everyone. The news of the waitress-turned-executive sent shockwaves of resentment through the staff. The manager, whose incompetence she had inadvertently exposed, was particularly venomous. He and a few envious colleagues began a subtle campaign of sabotage, viewing her not as an inspiration, but as an affront to the established order. They would conveniently forget to give her important messages from international clients, misplace files she needed for presentations, and start vicious rumors about how a girl from the Bronx had managed to charm the owner. Her new office, meant to be a symbol of her achievement, quickly began to feel like an island in a sea of hostility. She felt their animosity in the cold glances and whispered conversations that ceased the moment she entered a room. The corporate world was an alien landscape, and she was navigating it alone, without a map or an ally. The sabotage forced her to become hypervigilant, to work twice as hard just to stay afloat. She spent her nights not just caring for her mother, but studying corporate finance and international business etiquette, determined not to give her detractors any reason to see her fail. Her quiet dignity was her shield, her fierce intelligence her weapon. It's stories of quiet strength like this that are so often overlooked. If you believe these are the voices that need to be heard, your subscription helps us amplify them. Arthur was not blind to the staff's hostility, but he was caught in a difficult position. Intervening too directly would only fuel the rumors that he was showing her preferential treatment, potentially undermining her authority even further. His own social circle was equally unhelpful. At family dinners and exclusive clubs, he endured thinly veiled jokes about his charity case, his interest in Elena dismissed as a rich man's fleeting whim. These condescending remarks forced him to confront his own deep-seated prejudices and the true nature of his feelings. Was his desire to help her purely altruistic, or was he simply using her authenticity to fill the void in his own empty life? The question haunted him. Just as Elena began to find her footing in her new role, her world was violently upended. Her mother's condition took a sudden, catastrophic turn. A routine checkup revealed an urgent need for a complex and incredibly expensive surgery, a procedure with a six-figure price tag that her new, higher-tier insurance would only partially cover. The doctor delivered the news with clinical detachment, but for Elena, the words were a death sentence for the fragile hope she had just begun to nurture. The financial security that had seemed so solid just weeks ago evaporated in an instant, leaving her staring into the same abyss of debt and fear she thought she had finally escaped. The manager saw his opportunity in her crisis. While Elena was a whirlwind of frantic phone calls to doctors and insurance agents, her focus necessarily shifted from international client relations to the stark reality of her mother's mortality. She communicated her emergency with professional clarity, arranging to work remotely as much as possible. But her adversary twisted every unanswered email and rescheduled meeting into a weapon. He meticulously crafted a narrative of incompetence and neglect, presenting a dossier of her supposed failures to the senior leadership. He painted her as an ungrateful opportunist from the Bronx who, once given a taste of power, had abandoned her responsibilities at the first sign of personal trouble. It was a masterpiece of corporate backstabbing, designed to erase her success and validate his own bitter prejudice. The termination was delivered in a cold, glass-walled conference room. The manager presided over the meeting with a barely concealed smirk of triumph, flanked by two impassive human resources representatives who read from a script. Elena listened, numb, as they listed her alleged transgressions. The words gross negligence and breach of contract echoing in the sterile air. She didn't have the strength to defend herself. Her spirit was already at her mother's hospital bedside. She simply signed the papers, collected the few personal belongings from her desk, and walked out of the building, feeling the weight of 100 hostile stares on her back. The dream had lasted only a few months. Now she was jobless, facing catastrophic medical bills, and utterly alone. The glittering Manhattan skyline, a cruel monument to a future that had been stolen from her. When Arthur returned from his business trip in Geneva, the termination report was the first thing he saw. The manager's version of events was plausible on the surface, but it didn't match the character of the woman he had come to know. A cold, precise anger took hold of him. He bypassed human resources entirely, pulling security footage, phone records, and email logs himself. The digital trail told the true story, one of deliberate sabotage and malicious intent. The next morning, he called an emergency all-staff meeting in the main dining room of Eclat. With the entire team assembled, he calmly and systematically exposed the manager's lies, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable weight of absolute authority. He fired him on the spot, not for incompetence, but for a profound lack of humanity. A public declaration that the soul of his empire was no longer for sale. He drove to the city hospital himself, navigating a part of New York he had only ever seen through the tinted windows of a town car. The building's sterile corridors and the pervasive smell of antiseptic were a universe away from the curated luxury of his life. He found Elena in a small, grim waiting area outside the surgical wing, curled into a hard plastic chair, looking small and fragile under the harsh fluorescent lights. Her face was pale with exhaustion, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. For a moment, he just stood there, watching her, and the last vestiges of his gilded cage dissolved. He saw not an employee or a project, but a person enduring an unbearable weight. He walked over and sat down beside her, the chasm between their worlds vanishing in the shared, silent space of human vulnerability. He waited until she looked up, her eyes filled with a weary confusion at seeing him there. "Your greatest asset isn't speaking other languages, Elena," Arthur said, his voice softer than he intended, stripped of all its usual command. "It's your strength. I've spent my life building empty rooms, perfecting illusions of connection for people who have none. You are real. You've taught me what it means to have a purpose, to fight for someone you love." He met her gaze, and in his eyes she saw not pity, but a raw, startling sincerity. "Let me help, not as your boss, not as an act of charity, but as someone who believes in you." He didn't offer money or a job. He offered himself, his support, his partnership. In that moment, in the heart of her deepest despair, a new foundation was built, one of trust, respect, and a profound, unspoken affection. The surgery was a success. Arthur took care of everything, handling the hospital administration with a quiet efficiency that swept away the bureaucratic nightmares that had been tormenting Elena for months. He didn't just write a check, he was present, a calm and steadying force in the background, ensuring her mother received the best possible care. For the first time in years, Elena was able to simply be a daughter, holding her mother's hand through the long hours of recovery without the crushing weight of financial ruin pressing down on her. As her mother slowly regained her strength, a new kind of strength grew between Elena and Arthur. In the quiet hospital rooms, far from the cold perfection of éclat, they built a partnership grounded not in a shared business, but in shared humanity. He had saved her mother's life, and in doing so, he had shown her the true measure of his character. When Eleanor returned to the company, she did so not as the woman who had been fired, but as an indispensable leader. With Arthur's unwavering support, she stepped back into her role with a newfound confidence that was impossible to challenge. She didn't just manage international relations, she redefined them, creating bespoke cultural exchange programs for staff and implementing a client-first approach that saw profits and prestige soar. The whispers and side glances from her former detractors faded into a grudging respect, replaced by the undeniable evidence of her talent. Her relationship with Arthur blossomed in plain sight, a quiet and dignified love story that defied the city's rigid social strata. They were a team in the boardroom and in life. Their bond, a testament to the fact that true connection is blind to the artificial worlds of class and background. Inspired by her journey, Arthur discovered a purpose that eclipsed the pursuit of Michelin stars. He realized his wealth was not an end in itself, but a tool for creating genuine change. He established the éclat Institute, a foundation dedicated to identifying and nurturing talented young people from New York's underserved communities, just like Eleanor. The institute provided scholarships for language and culinary arts education, along with guaranteed first job opportunities within his restaurant group. He poured his energy into it, finding more satisfaction in mentoring a teenager from the Bronx than in closing a multi-million-dollar deal. He was no longer a ghost in his own machine. He was its heart, using his empire not to create temples of empty luxury, but to build bridges of opportunity and invest in the most valuable asset of all, human potential. 2 years later, Elena stood on a stage, addressing the first graduating class of the éclat Institute. She was no longer the weary waitress, but a poised, eloquent executive, her voice filled with a warmth that captivated the room. In the front row, her mother, vibrant and healthy, beamed with pride beside Arthur, who looked at Elena with an expression of profound love and admiration. The final shot of their life together was not one of opulence, but of shared purpose. They had found in each other a home, and together they were building a legacy of hope, proving that a single act of seeing someone's true worth can change the world. Stories like this remind us that empathy is the most powerful force we have, and by subscribing, you help us continue to share these testaments to the strength of the human heart.